The sky wasn't just a color to me. It was a vast, open canvas full of promise and freedom. Even as a young boy growing up near a small airfield in Ohio, I felt this invisible pull toward the heavens, like something deep inside was meant to fly. Now, at 65, standing by the window of my quiet home, watching planes draw lazy arcs across the sky, that old pull is still there. It wakes memories I thought I'd buried long ago. I remember the first time I climbed into a cockpit. The smell of worn leather seats mixed with cold metal filled my lungs. The engines hummed beneath my fingertips like a living thing. My heart beat faster, syncing with the roar of those machines. At that moment, I wasn't just standing on the ground anymore. I was flying. Training was grueling. Endless hours spent in simulators, instructors sharp as knives pushing me to the edge of my limits. Night flights under stormy skies that felt like the heavens themselves were trying to tear me apart. But with every challenge, I learned how to bend without breaking, how to trust the instruments, and most importantly, how to trust myself. From small prop planes to powerful jets that sliced through clouds like knives, every flight was a story of its own. There were thrilling moments, and there were terrifying ones. I faced storms that rattled the very glass around me, engine failures that turned peaceful skies into desperate fights for survival. But I survived. I adapted. I soared. There were also moments of unexpected joy. Making a smooth landing after hours of turbulence, seeing the grateful smile of a passenger, sharing quiet laughs with fellow pilots in the hangar at dawn. But life in the sky wasn't without loss. Some friends never came back from missions. Close calls left marks no one else could see. And nights when doubt and fear crept in, wrapped tight around my bones like a cold wind. Still, the sky was my home. My freedom, my purpose. Looking back now, decades later, I realized life is a lot like flying. You can't control the weather, but you can learn to navigate through it. And that makes all the difference. This is my story, of wings and storms, of courage and fear, of a man who answered the sky's call. Long before I ever sat in a cockpit or felt the engines roar beneath my hands, I was just a boy with wide eyes and a restless heart. Growing up in a small town nestled near the rolling hills of Ohio, the sky was my escape, the great open above that promised something bigger than the quiet streets I knew so well. My earliest memories are filled with the sound of airplanes flying overhead, their distant engines like thunderous whispers calling my name. I would lie in the grass for hours, watching them carve paths through the clouds, dreaming of the day I'd join them. I didn't understand how or when, only that it was my destiny. At school, I was the kid who carried model planes in his backpack, who built paper gliders that never quite flew right but never lost hope. I devoured every book I could find about flight. Stories of daring pilots, of planes that raced through storms, and of heroes who touched the sky and brought others along with them. My parents were practical folk. They wanted me to be safe, to have a steady job, maybe a life on solid ground. But I was stubborn. The sky wasn't just a dream, it was a calling. Every time I heard the roar of engines or saw the flash of wings against the sun, I felt alive. At 16, I got my first job at the local airfield. Not as a pilot, of course, not yet. As a mechanic's assistant. I learned to change oil, patch tires, and listen closely to the faintest sounds from an engine. I soaked in every detail, every scent of grease and gasoline, every creak and groan of aging planes. The smell of fuel was my perfume, the metallic tang a promise. I remember standing on the tarmac one summer evening, watching a small prop plane take off into the pink dusk. The pilot waved at me, and I raised my hand back without thinking. That moment, simple and quiet, was a spark. It was the first step on a path that would carry me from a boy full of dreams to a man in command of steel birds. Looking back now, I realize those early years shaped everything. The longing, the learning, the patience. They were the foundation of a life lived in the sky, a life I would soon begin to grasp with both hands. It was the summer of 1975 when I first touched the yoke of a real plane. I was 17, just a lanky kid with oil-stained hands and calloused knuckles from working long hours in the hangar. But on that particular July morning, something changed. Mr. Dalton, the gruff old pilot who ran the tiny flight school attached to the airfield, tossed me a set of keys and said, "Grab your logbook, we're going up." I froze. My heart stumbled in my chest like a propeller catching its first breath. I had waited for this moment for years, but now that it was here, I didn't know whether to shout, cry, or run. The plane was a Cessna 150, worn, chipped, but beautiful to me. I climbed into the left seat with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The vinyl was hot from the sun. The cockpit smelled like sun-baked leather, sweat, and the distant memory of 100 old flights. I buckled in, swallowing the lump in my throat, and looked at Dalton. He just smirked and said, "Don't crash." We taxied out, the wheels bumping over every crack and stone in the weathered tarmac. My palms were damp. The engine throbbed beneath us like a heart about to leap. And then he told me to take us up. I pulled gently on the yoke, and the nose of the plane tilted toward the sky. I held my breath. In a second, the ground slipped away like a dream fading at sunrise. The trees shrank. The hangar became a dot. We were flying. The world looked different from above, slower, softer, as if time itself had exhaled. I watched the winding rivers shimmer like silver ribbons below us. The cars were toys. My old neighborhood looked like it had been folded into the pages of a map. Everything I knew, everything that once felt so big, was suddenly small, manageable. And in that moment, I knew. This was where I belonged. Dalton didn't speak much during the flight. He let me find my own rhythm. I dipped the wings slightly, banked right, found the balance in my hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. When we finally touched back down, my legs were weak, but my heart was stronger than ever. I stepped onto the tarmac and looked up at the sky, still shimmering with the heat of summer and the rush of what I'd just done. I had flown. Not as a passenger, not in a dream, but as a pilot. It was the first time I truly understood what freedom felt like. And I knew I would chase this feeling for the rest of my life. It was the spring of 1979 when I flew my first solo across state lines. A milk run from Kansas to southern Missouri in a little Beechcraft Baron. Twin engine, moody on the ground, magnificent in the air. I was 21, barely seasoned, but hungry to prove I wasn't just a hobby flyer. I wanted to be trusted with distance, with responsibility, with sky. That day started smooth. The sun rode high behind scattered cumulus, and the Baron hummed like a cat in my hands. I followed the rivers, tracked the lines of the highway beneath, and checked my compass every few minutes like it was sacred. Somewhere near the border, I even started to whistle. Cocky, maybe, but free. But halfway over Missouri, the sky turned. It started with a flicker on the horizon. Clouds thickening in the distance, darker than they should have been. My gut twisted. I radioed the tower. Static. Tried again. More static. Then silence. The first gust hit like a slap. Hard, unpredictable. I gripped the yoke tighter. Lightning cracked to the east. Then came the rain. Not a gentle wash, but a waterfall slamming sideways against the windshield. Visibility dropped to nothing. I was in the air, alone. No radio, no ground in sight, and a storm clawing at my wings. I can't tell you exactly how long it lasted. Time bends when you're inside fear. But I remember my hands never left the yoke, white-knuckled, tense. I kept my eyes on the instruments. Attitude, altitude, heading. Repeating my training like a prayer. Trust the dials, not your gut. The Baron jolted. Once, twice. The second jolt made my head knock the ceiling. I thought I was going down. But I held on. I flew blind, believing that somewhere beneath all this madness was a runway waiting. I trusted the needles, the hum of the engines, the years of dreaming that had brought me here. And then, a break. A sliver of light. A clearing. Just enough for the airport beacon to wink through. I descended with everything I had left in me. Landed hard, bounced once, rolled out crooked, but alive. When I climbed out, soaked in sweat, legs trembling, an old mechanic leaned out of the hangar and gave me a slow clap. "Hell of a first storm," he grinned. "Welcome to real flying." That night, I sat on the wing of that plane, rain still tapping the metal, and stared into the sky. I had passed some invisible threshold. Flying had stopped being romantic that day. It had become sacred. It had become survival. Some years pass like whispers. Others carve their names into your soul. 1984 was such a year. By then, I had worked my way into regional airline cockpits, nothing too glamorous. Chicago to Cleveland, sometimes Detroit, even once down to Miami if someone called out sick. The planes were bigger, the stakes higher, the uniforms sharper. But the sky was still mine. One morning, as routine as any, I was flying an early route from Pittsburgh to Minneapolis. It was a crisp October day, the kind where the horizon glows a clean silver and everything feels a little more possible. Our cabin was nearly full, mostly suits and briefcases, except for one old man in seat 3A. Window seat, gray hat, wool coat, alone. There was nothing special about the flight. Clear skies, smooth air. We were cruising at 33,000 feet, and I was chatting with my co-pilot about weekend plans when the flight attendant's voice crackled in our headsets. "Captain, there's a situation in row 3. I turned around after we'd leveled. The old man was slumped over, pale as the clouds outside. Emergency protocols took over. We descended fast, cleared airspace, called ahead to Des Moines for an emergency landing. The crew moved with precision, but I'll never forget the silence in that cockpit. Because here's the truth. Flying trains you for engines on fire, for landing gear that won't come down, for lightning and tailwinds and malfunctioning indicators, but no one prepares you for the stillness of death. Not at 33,000 feet. We landed safely. Paramedics rushed in, but the man in 3A was already gone.
His name was Marvin, retired postmaster, flying to see his son. That's all I learned. But it was enough. That night I sat in my hotel room, looking out over a parking lot of yellow lights and rental cars, and I felt small. Smaller than ever before.
Because I had flown people through hurricanes, over mountain ranges, across continents, but sometimes you land and you still can't save them. That flight changed me. I never looked at my passengers the same way again. They weren't numbers or manifests. They were someone's father, someone's child, someone who dreamed of seeing snow again, or tasting their mother's pie, or just feeling needed. After that, I always walked the cabin before takeoff, made eye contact, smiled. Not because it was policy, but because I wanted them to know they were seen. And that day, the man in the window seat reminded me why I flew in the first place. When you're young, storms are something you run through to get home before your clothes are soaked. When you're a pilot, storms become poetry and terror all at once. I was 36 the first time I flew through a real one. Not turbulence, not the rough patches passengers groan about. A storm, a wall of moving sky, alive with lightning, a giant's breath swirling in chaos, just waiting to see if you'd flinch. It was a cargo run out of Dallas. Late shift, old plane, just me and one other pilot, a guy named Clark. Solid hands, few words. He'd flown in Nam, and you could see it in the way he didn't blink when things shook. We were carrying freight to Omaha. Weather radar showed possible cells, but we figured we'd skirt them. We didn't. About 40 minutes in, the radio went to static. Then everything outside turned black. Not nighttime black, a different kind, the kind that eats light. Then the shuddering began. I remember the sound more than anything, not the thunder, not even the wind. It was the rattling, the bones of the plane protesting like they remembered every crash in history and decided to scream. We dropped. Not long, maybe a few 100 feet. But in that drop, time stopped. Your stomach goes first, then your thoughts, then your sense of self. Clark glanced at me. No panic, just that nod like, it's us in the storm now. We rerouted, climbed, dodged, dipped. The sky fought back. Lightning danced across the wings, and for a second, one sharp second, I swore I saw my reflection in the cockpit glass, pale, sweating, lips whispering a prayer I didn't know I remembered. But we made it. We broke through somewhere over Kansas, and suddenly the night was clear again, stars cold and infinite. Just like that, the world went silent. Only the hum of the engine and the drip of adrenaline in my chest. When we landed, Clark lit a cigarette without a word. I asked him how he stayed so calm. He exhaled smoke and looked up and said, "Because the storm doesn't care if you're scared, so you don't give it the pleasure." That stuck with me. Later in life, when things shook, when my marriage hit rough air, when my brother got sick, when I stood by my mother's hospital bed, I remembered that storm. I remembered Clark's eyes, and I whispered to myself, "Fly the plane." After that storm, nothing looked the same from the cockpit. You'd think it would make you scared, but for me, it did the opposite. It made everything more alive. Every cloud a mystery, every takeoff a question, every landing an answer whispered in steel and gravity.
I started writing letters I never sent. Not to anyone in particular, just to the sky, to the silence, to the ghosts of old pilots whose names were carved on rusted memorials in lonely hangars. I wrote them in hotel rooms between flights, on napkins in diners, on the backs of flight manifests. My handwriting was awful, but the words came out fast, like they'd been waiting years to breathe. And in those letters, I confessed things I never told anyone, like how I still thought of Dad every time I saw a propeller spin, like how I hated flying alone, but needed it too, like how I wondered, sometimes late at night, what it would feel like to fly into the sun and not turn back. Those letters kept me human. They were the tethered to my soul in a job that demanded precision, not poetry. I remember one night, grounded in Phoenix, I wrote, "Tonight, the air feels heavy with memories. Like every plane that ever flew here left behind a sigh." I don't know why I remember that one line. Maybe because years later, when I found the love of my life, when I sat across from her at a little jazz club in New Orleans, and she asked me what I did, I answered, "I fly sighs through the sky." She laughed, thought it was a line, but I meant it. Every word. She was different from anyone I'd known. Sharp eyes, quiet voice, the kind of woman who listens with her whole heart. We talked until the bar closed, then walked the empty streets, her heels clicking like punctuation marks on the night.
I told her about the letters. She didn't laugh, just said, "I hope one day you let someone read them." I didn't answer, but that night, for the first time, I didn't write a letter. I just held her hand and let the silence speak. You never forget the first time the sky turns against you. It was supposed to be a routine flight, a mid-morning cargo run over the Rockies. Clear weather forecast, low winds, visibility perfect. I'd flown that route 100 times, but that day, the mountains had a different plan. About halfway through the pass, the instruments began to twitch, the kind of twitch that makes your stomach knot before your brain even registers danger. I radioed in, no response. Static. Dead air. Then the clouds rolled in, thick, sudden, unnatural, like smoke from a fire you couldn't see. I lost all horizon, nothing but white, disoriented. The altimeter dropped, fast. I pulled back on the yoke, but the plane was sluggish, like it didn't want to fight. It was like flying through wet cement. Then, a flash. A cliffside, closer than it had any right to be. Trees scraping the underbelly. I leveled just in time, skimming a ridge so close, the snow lifted from the peaks like a ghost trying to grab me. I broke through the cloud cover gasping, not for air, but for control. Landed hours later, hands still shaking, teeth clenched so tight I could barely speak. They called it a freak weather event, said it wasn't my fault, but I knew better. I'd gotten too comfortable, trusted the forecast more than my gut, forgot that the sky, no matter how blue it seems, always has teeth. After that, something changed in me. I double-checked every checklist, slept lighter, laughed less. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew, truly knew, how thin the line is between flight and fall. And still, I kept flying. Because every time I looked out that window, I saw more than danger. I saw the rhythm of life itself, unpredictable, vast, cruel, and breathtaking all at once, and I couldn't give it up. That crash didn't break me. It caused me, like wind shapes stone.
And when I told her the story, years later, on a beach under a sky that stretched forever, she didn't flinch. She just took my hand and whispered, "Maybe the sky needed to remind you it was alive too." They say some flights stay with you forever, not because of turbulence or mechanical failure, but because of who's waiting when you land. It was late spring. I was stationed in Denver, flying domestic routes, clocking hours, and chasing the dream like always. My father had been sick, lungs, heart, everything slowing down at once, like an old prop engine that no longer caught right. I'd gotten a call at 4:17 a.m. He didn't have much time. There was a red-eye I could have taken, but the airline needed me on shift. "Just one more trip," they said. "You'll be back by Sunday." I flew. I smiled at passengers. I recited safety procedures like poetry I didn't mean. The whole time, a clock was ticking in my chest. I landed 3 hours too late. He was gone. I stood at his bedside. Warm sheets, an empty space where his voice should have been. My mother held my hand without looking at me. She didn't need to. I hadn't been there. The skies had owned me. For the first time in my life, I hated them. I grounded myself for 3 weeks, walked the same road he used to walk every Sunday morning, sat in his old chair, ran my fingers over the cover of his flight logs. He used to be a private pilot in the military. Did you know that? No one did. Not really. He never talked much about his flying days, until I told him I wanted to be a pilot. Then he looked at me, nodded once, and said, "Then make the sky your friend, not your master." At the time, I didn't understand, but now I did. Flying wasn't about escaping life. It was about honoring it, even the moments you miss, especially those. So I went back to the air. But I flew differently, more aware, more grateful. And before every takeoff, I whispered to the clouds, "Let me land in time." Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. But every time, I flew for him.
Some flights blur together. Gates, checklists, autopilot. You forget what day it is or where you're going. But once in a while, someone boards your plane and leaves behind something more than luggage. It was a quiet Tuesday, routine route from Seattle to Chicago. Weather was good, crew was fresh, and I was already thinking about what sandwich I'd grab during the layover. I was captain on that flight, mid-career, confident, calm. Not much shook me anymore. Boarding was almost complete when I saw her. An older woman, no more than 5 feet tall, snow-white hair tucked into a scarf, holding a violin case like it was made of glass. The gate agent helped her with the overhead, but she insisted on keeping the case in her lap. As we reached cruising altitude, the attendant sent a note up to the cockpit. "Passenger in 14A requests a word with the captain, says it's important." I figured she was nervous. That happened, especially with older folks. But when I met her in the galley, she didn't look afraid. She looked certain. She said, "Captain, my husband flew for Pan Am. He passed last year. Every year we used to take this flight together. Today would have been our anniversary." I nodded, unsure what to say. She opened the violin case. Inside was not just the instrument, but an old Pan Am pilot's cap, perfectly preserved. She said, "I bring him with me, and I always ask the captain if I can play him one song above the clouds." She didn't ask to be in the cockpit.
She just wanted a moment of permission and privacy. I told the crew to dim the lights in the main cabin. I made an announcement, brief and soft. "Ladies and gentlemen, a fellow traveler would like to offer a small gift. Please enjoy." She played. A slow, trembling, heart-aching melody. I still don't know the piece, but I remember how the air changed. You could feel every note press into your chest. Passengers stopped what they were doing. Babies went quiet. Flight attendants leaned against the galley walls, eyes shining. For 4 minutes and 12 seconds, that airplane wasn't a tube of steel. It was a memory, a chapel, a sky full of what once was. She finished, bowed slightly, and returned to her seat. We landed on time. She thanked us all, kissed the cap, and disappeared into the crowd. And I sat in the cockpit for a long while, watching people leave, wondering how many invisible stories I'd flown over without ever knowing. Since then, I always imagined the sky wasn't empty. It was full of them. All the people we've loved, lost, and carried with us through the clouds. And maybe that's why we fly. Not to go somewhere new, but to remember what we can never leave behind. Some lessons, no matter how many hours of flight time you've logged, come screaming through the sky without warning. It was late November. Denver was blanketed in snow, clouds rolling in heavy like a slow avalanche above the Rockies. I'd flown into that airport 100 times, no big deal. Turbulence, a few bumps, but nothing to rattle the bones. I was flying a 737 that day, full cabin, business travelers, young couples, a high school hockey team in the back. Their coach had asked to see the cockpit before we took off. He said one of the boys wanted to be a pilot. I told him he'd change his mind. We were cruising at 34,000 feet when I heard it. A grinding sound. Low. Mechanical. Wrong. You don't mistake it once you've heard it before. Then a flicker on the panel. Then the alarms. Engine 2 had failed. My co-pilot, Jake, froze for a split second. Green kid, sharp mind, but this was his first real test. I didn't shout. I didn't panic. That kind of fear spreads faster than smoke in a cockpit. I said, "You have the controls. I'll handle the procedure." I spoke like I was ordering a sandwich, but inside every nerve in my body was lit up like a lightning rod. Denver isn't flat country. We were flying into mountainous terrain, low on power, heavy with fuel. We radioed in. Emergency code, cleared path, priority landing. I remember looking out through the windshield and thinking, so, this is how it could all go. Not in flames, not in terror, but in cold, clinical, quiet focus. We descended with only one engine, navigating wind shear and ice warnings like threading a needle in a thunderstorm. At one point, the nose dipped too far. I felt the tail shudder, my breath caught just for a heartbeat. Jake corrected just in time. Good kid. I'll never forget that. When the wheels touched the runway, the entire plane broke into applause. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just sat there, still, breathing. It wasn't fear I felt. It was clarity. The realization that all the years of training, the sleepless nights, the stress, the checklists, They were for that moment, for the 5 minutes that might have meant everything. Later that evening, back at the hotel, I stood at the window and looked out at the runway lights blinking in the fog. One of the hockey boys found me in the lobby. He handed me a folded napkin. On it, a drawing. Me in the cockpit with a giant cape. "You saved us," he said. I told him, no, I didn't. The plane saved them. The training saved them. But maybe, just maybe, I earned my wings all over again that day. There's something no one tells you about retirement. How loud the silence is when the engines stop. After that Denver emergency, I flew for 6 more years. I logged my final flight from San Diego to Seattle on a cool April morning, the kind where the air feels cleaner than it should, like nature is telling you, pay attention, this one's special. The airline gave me the usual farewell. Water cannons over the fuselage, champagne at the gate, a plaque that would end up collecting dust in my den. My wife was waiting at the arrivals hall, holding a balloon that said, "Congratulations, Captain." It was the same look she gave me on our wedding day. Proud, steady, loving. She'd been my ground crew since day one. But what they don't prepare you for is the day after. When you wake up and there's no flight plan, no simulator, no uniform, just your slippers and the birds outside your window mocking you with their effortless flight. I tried to fill the space. Golf, woodworking, even joined a retired pilots group where the only thing more rigid than our backs was our refusal to admit we missed it all. One afternoon, I found myself reorganizing old logbooks. Page after page of flight records, numbers, coordinates, notes scribbled in margins. And then I came across a photo. Me in the jump seat of a Cessna, 1971. My first solo flight. Grinning like I'd just stolen the moon. That night, I had a dream. I was back in the clouds. No passengers. Just me and the yoke. Everything outside was golden. Sun breaking through layers of cloud like some ancient cathedral in the sky. And I felt it again, that freedom, that weightless sense that the world was endless. I woke up crying. Not from sadness, but because I remembered. I remembered what it felt like to be part of the sky. So I made a choice. Not to fly again. Those days were behind me. But to teach. I volunteered at a local aviation school, gave guest lectures, told stories. Honest ones. Not the romantic ones, but the real ones. About fear, responsibility, the dull ache in your spine after a 12-hour flight, and the miracle of walking through turbulence and coming out whole. One of the students, a girl with fire in her eyes, asked me once, "What do you miss most?" I thought for a long moment. Then I said, "The silence. Not the one after retirement, the one up there, between the clouds, when the radio's quiet, the engines hum, and for just a second, you forget the world exists." Flying had always been my escape, my passion, my purpose. But it wasn't until I met her, the woman who would ground me in ways no landing ever could, that I realized there was a whole other world waiting beyond the cockpit. Her name was Evelyn. We met at a charity gala hosted by the airline in New Orleans, a city alive with jazz and possibility. She wasn't a pilot, nor was she drawn to the sky like I was. She was an artist, painting canvases full of light and color, capturing moments I barely noticed. At first I was cautious. Flying demands control. Love demands surrender. I wasn't sure I was ready to let go of the reins. But Evelyn had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that life was not just about chasing the horizon, but also about finding peace where you land. We spent late nights walking the French Quarter, her hand in mine, the city humming beneath our feet. She taught me to see the world differently, to slow down, to listen, to feel. I told her stories of the sky, the storm over Missouri, the engine failure in Denver, the man in the window seat with his violin. She listened without blinking, as if those moments were sacred secrets. Our love wasn't perfect. It was weathered by long hours apart, missed birthdays, and the constant pull of my career. But it was real, and it was ours. When I finally retired, Evelyn was the first to say, "Now you can fly without leaving the ground." And she was right. Together, we built a life full of color and calm. I learned to paint beside her, strokes trembling but hopeful. We traveled to quiet places, beaches where the ocean whispered lullabies, mountains that touched the sky I used to command. And in those moments, I realized flying wasn't just about defying gravity. It was about love, the invisible force that holds us steady when the winds change. Aging changes everything, even a pilot's relationship with the sky. At 60, I began to notice the subtle shifts. My reflexes weren't as sharp. The nights grew heavier with aches that no flight could shake. And worst of all, the creeping fear that one day the sky might betray me. Flying had always been about trust. Trust in the plane, the instruments, my own hands. But when you grow older, trust becomes complicated. Doubts whisper louder. Are you still good enough? Still fast enough? Still sharp enough to save yourself and your passengers? I faced those fears head-on. One cold morning, during a training simulation, my instructor put me through a scenario where every system failed. Engines gone, communications dead, visibility nil. Panic surged. I fought it down. I calmed my breath, and I reached deep for the years behind me. When I finally pulled the plane safely out of the virtual storm, the instructor nodded. You still have it. The mind, the skill, the heart. But the truth was more complicated. I knew I couldn't fly forever. The idea of letting go terrified me. It felt like losing a part of my soul. Yet Evelyn reminded me gently, falling isn't the end. It's just a change in course. I began to see fear not as an enemy, but a compass pointing me toward new horizons. So I started mentoring young pilots, sharing my stories, my mistakes, my triumphs, teaching them not just how to fly a plane, but how to carry themselves through storms, in the sky and in life. The fear of falling didn't disappear, but it no longer ruled me. Because flying wasn't just about staying up. It was about knowing how to rise again. Now at 65, I find myself standing by the ocean's edge, where the endless sky melts into the sea. The same sky that once called me to fly now wraps around me like a warm embrace. The waves lap gently against the shore, a steady rhythm that reminds me of the steady pulse of an engine humming under my hands. I look back on a life lived in motion, thousands of miles flown, countless sunsets chased from the cockpit, friendships forged in tiny cabins far above the world. Every flight was a story, every landing a victory, every takeoff a leap of faith. But the greatest lesson the sky ever taught me was this: sometimes coming home is the most courageous flight of all. Retirement was not an end, but a beginning, a chance to slow down and finally savor the moments I'd long rushed past. I rediscovered the joy of simple things: morning coffee, watching the sunrise, the laughter of grandchildren playing on the porch, the quiet satisfaction of holding my wife's hand as we watched the horizon together. The ocean and the sky are vast and free, just like they were when I was young. But now, I see that freedom doesn't mean endless wandering. It means knowing where you belong, in the hearts of those you love, in the memories you cherish, in the life you continue to build. Every scar, every challenge, every triumph has led me here, grounded but uplifted. I am proud of the miles I have flown, the storms I have weathered, and the man I have become. And though my days of flight have slowed, my spirit soars higher than ever. Because home isn't just a place. Home is a feeling, a choice, a promise that no matter where the winds take us, we always carry the sky within. As I breathe in the salty air, I smile. The horizon is still out there, vast and inviting, full of possibilities. And I know, deep in my bones, that every ending is just the start of something new. The sky gave me wings. Now I am ready to fly in new ways, with love, with hope, with gratitude. This is my homecoming, and it is beautiful.